And more, yeah, you're okay.
Yes, sir.
We're starting with a section on consumption, and we'll have a subsection really on the arts at the end of this, which is, the readings are here, and we will just talk about more about that, but I'll just point out that the arts and their rise are featured in many of the readings and many of the discussion points we've had from the beginning of the course. So that theme is not to be forgotten, will be more explicit. And then review. Yeah, the review section is next Wednesday. So next Monday is the art section. Okay. Yes.
Just wanted to stop by and say hello. Copy. Nice to meet you.
Okay, great.
Is
Thank
everything
you.
going well in here?
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you very much. These guys are terrific.
Awesome.
There's Joe.
Okay.
I'm Jay.
Jay.
Yes,
Okay,
how are you?
Okay, awesome. Perfect. Well, let me know if you need anything. I'm about to head out.
We'll talk when we have time.
Yes, of course. I'll give you a call later this week.
Sure. Reading is the city's entertainment, which is paperback and hardback. There are a couple of big points I want to, make that's great. I want to make here. And what's the focus? Entertainment, consumption, amenities as relate to politics and urban development. These distinct concepts we explore, but the bigger message is that all of these contrast with a more common assumption that production and material work drive life and give it meaning. This common assumption informs a materialist view that money talks. The Marxist emphasis on relations to the means of production. The psychological view of Maslow and Engelhardt that basic wants are hierarchically ordered and the physical material comes first. Did the dot-com boom or terrorist attacks of September 11th bring the end of consumption? Even among those committed to a totally materialist worldview, a time of economic turbulence and cutbacks, basically no. And I showed a jobs growth result the other day, and the sectoral change is what I'm talking about. There's an increase in jobs and activities, a decline, obviously, in agriculture, a huge decline in manufacturing of traditional, that is, it's the big decline is the way this is normally measured is with the labor force. The proportion of the labor force where people are working in jobs in the manufacturing sector is smaller and smaller. Much of that is due also has held on more for organize a political party. Those matter hugely based on the number of votes, the number of people, the number of marchers in a parade or a protest. the number of strikers, et cetera. As those go down, the traditional neo-Marxist blue-collar proletariat union side, the traditional left, has declined as well. Okay, so that would actually be an influence culture idea. I'm linking it here. As we saw on those arrows, as you see in the boxes of causal changes that we have going on with these three big boxes leading to the rise of the new political culture and then scenes, is that scenes in conjunction with what we earlier called social issues are now on the rise, but the key aspects of social issues include especially entertainment and consumption rather than traditional production. Okay, big, simple point. This is one of the first books ever to do this. We couldn't find much literature at all on the topic, specifically how does consumption work. Either it was abstract about supply and demand, or money which is being spent or invested, but it doesn't get to some of the more interesting specifics. So what we've done in this book is first to sort of state the kind of frame that I just did, the theories behind us, behind the times. How can we update it? So what we did was in the next big chapter, was to go through a series, to create a series, 40, 50 propositions, the best ideas we could find in the social sciences, geography, sociology, political science, economics, anthropology, and to inventory those core ideas, such as Thorstein Veblen's conspicuous consumption. He talked about it at the turn of the century. This is the core idea, still continuing with Pierre Bourdieu, that people people with more money show they have more money by flaunting it either loosely and grossly, or with great refinement, or with other things. From Louis XIV, who talked about building Versailles as the excess is a very necessary thing. It's one of his quotes. The excesses of gardens, fireworks, etc. Some people clearly do feel and act that way, but is that enough? Is that sufficient to explain all of the rise in consumption that we're talking about? And the answer is no. That if we look more closely, there are many different kinds of things going on. And where might we look more closely to see some of the data in this field? Page 24 has a list of the big concepts and related kinds of indicators. And these range from women and their families as a post-industrial society concept, in contrast to men and their work as neo-Marxist concepts, to less attention to context by individualist theorizing. Post-industrial concepts are more citizen-focused, individual citizen. Neo-Marxist concept system-focused, like capitalism, aristocracy. The individualistic concept is individual preferences, personality focused. So big concepts are there. Where these came in from people like Daniel Bell, Ron Engelhardt, Lipset, Clark, The New Political Culture. These come together and have added more specific components in the last 20 years, and you're the foundation of what we've discussed in more detail in this book. All right, the next big point I want to feature is, look it up on page 33, 34. social background characteristics are modestly related to most DDB items. The DDB is one of the biggest surveys that is repeated every year or two, was done by a big advertising firm, or is still done. And the items, there's something like, I think, 50,000 plus, depending on which item you look at, 50,000 plus individual, these are American respondents who have answered these questions. Big N, that is, this is much, much bigger than a normal national citizen survey of 1,500, 40,000, 50,000. And I use this to feature the idea leading into the theories, which I've stated elsewhere here, but I'm giving you a clear table to look at. Table 3 here. And across the top, we have into which one of the following categories does your annual household income fall? Income, level of education, occupational, scored high to low on status, African American or not. Okay, classic diversity, race, class, gender types of occupations. Yeah, we have about 40, 50 items, something like that. Food shopping frequency in the last 12 months. Went to a club meeting. The car I drive is a reflection of who I am. Worked on a community project. Went to an exercise class. Went fishing. Went hunting. Job, went to a library a number of times in the last 12 months. How strongly are race, class, gender, etc., explaining these participation activities? Asked you this before. Anybody look up, not just me, I'm saying this is my version because this is a large N and it's good data over time, but you can look in most any social science journal with a qualification of an Indian paper we had recently. If you only have, how many states are there in India?
29. 29 now.
29 states in India. You've got a very small N. So if you look at a correlation, maybe there's a relationship between two things, but with only 29 cases, if you look at, say, education with race or with poverty, they're all so strongly interrelated that you can't distinguish statistically, or the way normal statistical concern would be, what are the effects of one independent of the other? To do that, you need a bigger N. And so that's why we're doing this, not just with 1,500, although you get the same kind of result. You go up to 40,000, and the ends of the sizes of the curve, these are simple Pearson correlations. 0.08, 0.13, 0.15, minus 0.11. These are all weak. Race, class, gender, national origin are not deterministic. Roughly 85, depends on, obviously, if you have a low end, how you generate the 85% will then will go up. But with a bigger, more robust end, maybe 85% is not determined by any of these things. Okay, when I presented that in the past, and I'll even stop here for a minute. Most students of you have said can't be wrong. It can't be. It must be wrong. I know. Everybody else in other classes, all the professors say the opposite. The news media say the opposite. The testimony and that for big national policies say the opposite. In India, they have much more affirmative action than we do in the US, for instance. And that's founded on the assumption that poor people can't get ahead. So however, when you start looking more closely at the mobility rates around the world, this was a revolution in around 1950 when Lipset and Bendix did that for Europe and the US, and everybody said, oh, America's got this Horatio Alger, poor people get rich fast, whereas Europe is closed, the way Bourdieu describes it. What did the data show? The opposite. They're about the same. European mobility rates were about the same as the Americans. India is obviously a very special case with a caste system. But I'm even including it here because we're moving beyond just the European-US comparisons. We want to try to look more at where and how to even caste work within the political system. And the two leading Indian experts here in political science, the Rudolphs, have a book on the caste system became basically political parties, and that's what we have. Okay, without going into that in detail, I'm just throwing that out in conjunction with these low R's to make this simple point. And let me give you just a couple of examples of the propositions then. Number 6, stronger. Sorry,
Which table is this?
yeah, this is it's table 3, page 33 in the book.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, if yeah, I didn't send it to you, but yeah, I guess you're looking at it on Canvas.
Mhm.
Yeah, if that's easy, sure, just throw it up. Couple of examples of propositions. 6, the stronger the commitment to moral asceticism, particularly as it emerged with Calvinist Protestantism, the more that personal consumption and behavior by the individual and society are defined or constrained by moral precepts and beliefs. By contrast, secular persons or non-believers should be constrained less by academic values and personal consumptions, and political concerns should be driven by other factors. Okay, this is a big general idea from Max Weber. It's in Gorski, it's in Engelhard and Hart. But for some persons, these moral principles are driven in a direct, literal manner by organized religious norms and institutions. Devout Muslims do not drink alcohol, and so forth. Okay, so we're bringing in with these not only things which are big social science, but also pretty straightforward things that everybody knows about. But we're inventorying things which are not just available from the normal, simple, descriptive statistics. We're bringing in a wider range of ideas to encourage people. That is, this is the theory chapter with a bunch of propositions, 50 or so. And we then we brought in, we did some original data analysis for a few years, papers which do explore these things with empirical data. And we have some bits of that, but most of the book is really a challenge to others to push this further, and that is happening. Book won a prize. People are paying attention. People are really doing this. Most visibly, the economists. I'd say economists and historians are the leaders in the social sciences in doing this. Sociologists, political scientists are still often talking about, oh, money explains everything. It's income, etc. Not all together, not everywhere, but surprising how the economists talk less about money. And my favorite example, of course, is China, where in their 5-year plan, they dropped their economic growth this year for the first time. They're not saying we're going to grow 8%. They're saying we're going to focus on making Chinese cities cleaner, nicer, more livable, and have scenes and aesthetics become more salient. They are more salient, and we're going to build more policies in conjunction with that. That's a revolution. Okay. There are lots more details and specifics, but let me pause if any of you have looked a bit at this and want to raise a question about the kinds of things which I've said in conjunction with this general point. And I use it as a book because what we have then in the rest of the section, especially the Scenescapes book, really is we spent 12 years writing the Scenescapes book. Is a follow-up and and plus the Kentuckville Karaoke is the international version. So these three, this came first, but I'm framing it here to show you how the three are interconnected. Questions on any of this? Or I'll talk more about Scenescapes and then we can talk about it all together. But if you have anything brief just on this, for instance. Anybody hear this before in any other class or read this anywhere? Okay, very seldom. I talk, okay, I say it. There's lots of noise. There's lots of room for more variables, for more recombinations of how they fit together. And that's exactly what we're doing as we move to the next phase. That is, it's begun here in the empirical work, but we really did it in the Scenescapes book. So we articulate where and how and why a holistic approach can really give you a different view of the world, and we can build a different kind of social science. All right. So we've got the PowerPoint from that, then please. And this doesn't have the it doesn't some of this, but most of these don't have to be tightly linked to what I say. So don't wait for me to say next slide. I could just sort of go through them. But I'll look a little bit when we're and this obviously is a big collaborative project. Europeans, Asians, etc. Since 1968 and 1989, we see complex confrontations among citizens, civic groups, unions, and traditional political parties. New types of diversity and immigrant rights, ambitious policies. The new social movements, environmentalists, feminists, human rights, paved the way in the 1970s. But the 21st century went much further. After Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, the Occupy movements from Wall Street to hundreds of other cities, the fall of national leaders in Cairo, Kiev, and more, with repercussions from Buenos Aires to Hong Kong. The new movements of many subpopulations really implement protests, parades, demonstrations, with puppets, songs, dances, created and directed carefully for videos of mass and social media. The Hollywood-style destruction of the World Trade Center and similar Parisian events orchestrated violence theatrically. These created new powerful scenes. Potential responses to these include no populist leaders from Greece and Brazil, the Philippines, Kiev, the Mayor Ford of Toronto, and Donald Trump. What this sociologists and social scientists, political scientists, and others, as well as the media, as well as the leaders themselves, have to say about this as analysts, not just as moralists saying it's good or bad. Theories of the crowd in the 19th century remain underdeveloped. And we social scientists study many subjects, but sociological journals use the same key explanations. Race, class, professional activity, race, class, professional activity, gender, and nationality of origin are the four essential characteristics to explain dozens of topics from participation to happiness. The world is flat. Bowling alone. Do this. The mass media use these four with linking these with specific events, but look more closely and you see what I'm describing with our table. 85% remains largely unexplained. Alas, the modesty of these results is largely ignored. These results is largely ignored by many talented commentators like Pierre Bourdieu, Jean-Claude Passeron, in their book the Ayers and Distinction, or Americans Paul DiMaggio, Sharon Zuckin, and many more. We live in a highly probabilistic and weakly deterministic world, especially if we compare nations. Studying down, getting down to cities and neighborhoods is a great way to analyze and sharpen these, because we can find more diversity, sometimes homogeneity, but more diversity if you compare, Bronzeville with a 99% plus me Black neighbors with a place that's 99% white, Palo Alto or parts of Palo Alto, etc. Thus, a wider range makes it possible to have more sharp differences, and then you can sort out more the impact, say, of race from income and poverty. Otherwise, they're all just mushed together. If you use U.S. state level data, we have 48, 50 states, whatever. And it's worse with Indian states, when you got half as many. A few persons are stressing new topics and processes beyond the traditional. Public art, public space, creative placemaking, new migration dynamics, neighborhood differences are all being now discussed. And in this spirit, my first goal is to offer a list of concepts which can help to justify and specify dynamic urban processes. And second, to sketch an approach which joins many more specific processes. And third, present some results comparing cities around the world. We call this approach scenes. The scene, what's the theme? It seeks not to, I'll elaborate, but for now, I'll simply say it doesn't seek to replace, but to add to the classic concepts like class and race, and thus enrich the social science toolbox. Since '68, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Tiananmen protests of 1989, the world has deeply changed. Yet many social scientists still teach us if we only had Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. Urban theorists like Zimmel, the Chicago 20s ecologists, and the early Castells, Logan Mollich's urban fortunes. How update these past theories? About half of the manual labor forces disappeared since the 1950s in Europe and North America. Half of the labor force is gone, compromising the Marxist analysis of industrial society. We live in an increasingly post-industrial world with new roles for cities in particular, which are in the lead in these changes. Students are the new proletariat. You, maybe not Anna in her high school, but she's now not in that high school. She's doing different things. She's got those contrasts visibly surrounding. Creativity, ideas, culture have become essentials. We have to catch up to the public, journalists, and a handful of urban political leaders, building on 1968 and 89. Who are these? Chinese designers, Korean and Japanese cultural policies. These are transforming Asian export production economies and central planning to a new focus on consumption through the arts, directly targeted by strong governments. This is not happening in the US, where things are much more private sector decentralized in that sense. But in China, mass rural urban migration is not motivated by employment alone. Younger people in Asia challenge the family and other hierarchies. The urban scene of big cosmopolitan cities attract the young and talented. Beijing is seriously pursuing nightlife as a new urban policy topic. New issues such as limiting environmental pollution, dealing with flood victims, and combating corruption transform the focus on economic growth. In Southern Europe, where Roman law and the Catholic hierarchy were the source of many theorized past models, Frankfurt was seen as new. One day in Frankfurt, Adorno told the class, I was there, quote, "You felt Hitler's boot. But Horkheimer and I went to the US where it was even worse. People there did not realize that they were forced to smoke cigarettes, see Hollywood movies, ride in big cars, and lead a lifestyle imposed by advertising, unquote. Their famous Hollywood article, it's really one major article, elaborates these same kinds of themes. And remember though, the second face of Adorno is that of a subtle, critical, nuanced, atonal music composer. I propose that we pass over the first Adorno and extend the second, as we do in the scenescapes. So in the class, we talk about Marxism is too simple, and they illustrated how they could be through Marxists in this respect. But we must introduce the aesthetic and emotional power of the arts into our central thinking, which they started to do. They tried, at least initially, they explored a crude materialist version thereof. And we need this for cities in particular. Why did Adorno stress advertising? Because it makes a direct link between capitalism and the consumer. It destroys consumer autonomy and individualism, challenged by Walter Benjamin with his idea of the flâneur, the shopper, the wanderer in the streets, as a causal social engine. Benjamin's in-depth study of Paris has global significance now, and just show one more. So we see Max Weber, and then here we have Baudelaire, Balzac, and then let's go one more. No, okay, let's wait a second. Maybe I don't have a picture of Benjamin right here after all. But we've got more stuff which we'll see in a second. His in-depth study of Paris has global significance now in our post-industrial era. Benjamin's Paris is an answer. Shopping, entertainment, consumption, lifestyles, cafes, and the poetry of Baudelaire, the theater of Brecht, who distilled these elements of street life. Sorry, let me not include Brecht there. I just had his picture, so I'm linking him here to the discussion. So we have Brecht and Benjamin playing chess, as they were both ostensibly Marxist, and they were both doing and using the arts. Benjamin's source of evidence was the poetry of Baudelaire. The recognition of Benjamin is the leading intellectual of the Weimar Republic, and Baudelaire, the most respected cultural model of late 19th century France, suggests that smart citizens surpassed the simple deterministic theories that were stressing race, class, and materialism. Likewise, Baudelaire himself edited the Journal of Wagner Studies. Wagner wrote 5 volumes of prose before composing his most important music in the Ring of the Nibelung. He destroyed the classic tradition, the classic symphony, from Bach to Mozart and Beethoven. And Wagner's concept of the total artwork, we got to get find Wagner there. It's up or down somewhere, next to Levi Strauss, I think. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. The holistic artwork, the Gesamtkunstwerk, integrated huge numbers of little themes by combining theater, poetry, the music into a holism inspired by the people, the folk, its myths, its songs, and its moral foundations. Some of these concepts were taken up by Weber and Durkheim, talking about the collective consciousness, basic values, the Protestant ethic. You have that element, but that came 50 years later, 40, 50 years after Wagner and other German philosophers were playing with these ideas. They were doing it, and so Wagner did it not with, and I'm pointing out in terms of variables here. He didn't have 24. He had hundreds of themes. Then Claude Lévi-Strauss, leading anthropologist ever, explicated, codified cultural context, including myths, in his 4-volume work on mythologie. Production and social relations focused on producing goods and services remain the foundations of most social science, especially those of Marx, but not only. We're not proposing to abandon these, as I've said, but to enrich, to contextualize, to reframe them. The scene and network elements. The most decisive that we've added most explicitly is aesthetics, and how aesthetics are linked to the underlying values, like the caste or Brahmanism. This is refused, especially after 1968, when many said studying culture would blame the victims. The Moynihan Report talked about it briefly. But William Julius Wilson, the distinguished African-American sociologist, later reversed his position. He said that himself 20 years earlier. And it slowly changed. It is slowly changing others. Cities are an ideal way to lead the social sciences in this respect, and the public policy discussions in Paris and in media and so forth. The molecular aesthetic. Okay, so let's push on, but just in terms of our. Okay, let's stop on there for a second. How might a periodic table of contents, cultural elements look? It would start not with the chemicals, but with discrete pieces of aesthetic sense, tradition, transgression, neighborhoods. Since the same aesthetic dimensions are potentially present in all empirical spheres, but vary in intensity, these qualities can and should be isolated from each other, so that each ideal typical quality, like local authenticity, expression, self-expression, has its own character. Empirical, and so an ideal character. We can define these ideals, neighborhoods. An empirical city or an empirical actual neighborhood is a unique, each individual neighborhood, Hyde Park, is a unique combination of multiple abstract dimensions of scenes. How to identify these deep structures of scenes? We did not invent any of the 15 dimensions. Okay, yeah, here we go. 15 dimensions listed here. These came from centuries of poetry. We have this on the, it's there, okay?
Yes.
Good. Novels, cultural theory, and philosophy. Although not a close system, these 15 deep structures correspond to the chemical elements. And we call this our grammar of scenes, closer to Lévi-Strauss, who built his mythology explicitly from Wagner, using his basic grammar of mythological elements. But he added context that we extend. A similar sensibility is found in some classics of sociology, such as social science. I presented this in part of sociology. I mixed the two terms. But most of this is social science. Favors ideal types. The Protestant ethic, or the overseas, or his typology within China, the overseas merchant, or the widespread urban-rural abstraction of Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, rural urbane styles. And our 15 dimensions are explicitly general, like those, to permit combining them into multiple empirical scenes. And this type of scenes analysis starts from certain basic components. And the scene includes geographic districts rather than only the city or nation to capture more numerous local differences. So we have 400 zip codes in the Chicago area, rather than just one city or, of course, one little nation. These more extreme cases are helpful. And like Levi-Strauss, we use not a few, but hundreds of elements to create the scenes and put them together. Postal codes are the smallest generally available units, over 40,000 in the US. Generally available with census data, which will say what proportion of the zip code residents are at what educational level, income level, race level, what kinds of jobs, what kinds of occupations. And even the smaller zip codes are excluded because of confidentiality concerns. So that's the reason we don't go further down, but you can for certain things, just like population size. But to use and to find this powerful micro data, it's necessary to study in depth unpublished electronic archives. Hitherto, unseen. We discovered them by talking to census people. Smaller, oh yeah, we got it. If you send us $50 and wait 6 months, and we'll send you a CD-ROM. That's what we did. Then you start to work with it. You try to work with a CD-ROM. What is this? So it takes months to get the useful data together. We also use the electronic yellow pages with hundreds of different types of restaurants, churches, hunting and fishing camps. About 400 or 500 of these. Social media, or my number, the numbers in the book. I can't remember exactly. Social media and the new internet sources add more options continually. The techniques by which we convert these millions of bits of raw data into scenes dimensions for each neighborhood are illustrated in some of what we're going to look at next. And we also use photographs, case and individual case studies of dramatic instances, which is why I love your high school in the South. We aim both for the subtlety of artists, but the coherence of scientists. New kinds of data like social media and the internet downloads permit far more of both than in the past. We have an explosion of what's called things like the digital humanities, people putting all of the novels of the 19th century online and then say, how can we make sense of these words? And how is Balzac different from Dickens, and how is Dickens different from, etc. Does this approach break with much previous work in culture and the arts and much of social science? We're now living with changes comparable, I'm suggesting, to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, but more complex and subtle. The scenes are emerging as a concept from the transformations of 68 and 89, increased education linked to global migration, the internet, new cultural ideals. But these are not universal. Specifics vary by neighborhood around the world. We've schematized these major changes with a new political culture and in 10 books on scenes, which I'm summarizing now with some of the essential points. I talked about the new political culture already, so I'm skipping over that. But I'm just pointing out again, Benjamin, who added the flaneur as a cultural engine, and the arcades. Yeah, we have pictures. Get pictures of that. For just further on down, just keep on going down to a couple of pictures of the arcades transform shops into scenes. What's the idea of the arcade? Anybody? Yes. Almost raising your hand.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding, like a video arcade? Like a video game arcade?
Like a what?
Like a video game arcade? Maybe I'm missing something.
Benjamin's concept. No, okay, Benjamin's concept is what Paris did in the 1830s. They had a lot of little shops and it rains. It rains in Paris from October to May. It's either drizzle, gray, rainy, fog, and it's wet. Is that a time to go shopping and stand in the streets? No. So what did they do in 1830? We have,
Professor, I'm not seeing photos.
yeah, they're not separate. This is part of the same PowerPoint.
Yes, sir, I'm in the
Oh,
same
okay, yeah, yeah. Okay, so maybe, I'm not sure. What did they do in 1830? They put glass and steel over the tops of the street. So you would have steel and then bits of glass, so you could go shopping and not get rained on. Arcade. 1830, 1890, they started department stores. They put all the stuff, here we go. There's an arcade. They put all the stuff in a single big building, which we now have today. And then mid-20th century, malls bring this together. So these are an extension of sort of mass producing the idea that it's easier for shoppers. So the shoppers, in terms of gender roles, were couples in the arcades, and it's really the man who was the leader in choosing the necktie or the pretty shoes for his lady friend on his arm. When they had friendly, safe department stores, the men gave up. They joined instead. There's studies on this by the French. They went into hunting clubs. They went hunting. They joined other kinds of clubs that were no longer shopping, and women went galore shopping. And maybe parts of that continues with the motorcycles on King Drive today, with these macho guys and women. Okay, more complicated roles. While the hierarchy withers, just scroll on a little bit more. There's a couple of these that connect. Oh, okay, and then we that's it with Benjamin. The aesthetic prism is no longer limited to gentlemen with top hats on the boulevard. Democracy and egalitarianism join technology in the smartphone and music, clothes and tattoos as strong markers of identity. It can reinforce or sometimes counter race, class, sex, and ethnicity. While the hierarchy withers, arts and political movements that focus on a bohemian, single or anti-hierarchical issue, as in Kiev, as in Hong Kong, these down with the Communist Party or down with the hierarchy or down with the Russians give way to pluralism and more specific issues. I had people write to me from Beijing 15 years ago, and I would say, you know, and they would say, we want to work on these things you're writing about in Beijing. And I said, well, give me some examples of how you see this in the city of Beijing. Well, you know what's cool, new, and hot in Beijing? So what? Dog walking. Okay. Dog walking, not the Hong Kong, you know, we want. So that's what you have. You have down with everything when there's one big hierarchy. The man, capitalism, so forth. When the man begins to break up into big tech, big firms, small firms, black breweries, etc. Then you get different kinds of smaller, more complicated processes, themes, and elements. This appears as cultural relativism in the bottom box of our big causal model there, with more social and cultural tolerance in the development of art forms and subtypes. Some popular groups now use over 100 categories to define their music, from blues to house. 1968 was not a Marxist revolution. It did not abolish capitalism. Some therefore saw it as empty. Yet it was a revolution of culture, aesthetics, equal participation, democracy, and identity. And it has led to new social movements and to the political correctness, so-called, of the current political cultural scene. And approximately 60 to 70% of Europeans, North Americans, and Japanese citizens support these major elements of the new political culture in terms of gender, racial tolerance, human rights, and so forth. Although whether these 60 to 70% get represented through the voting of the political system depends heavily on the workings of the political system, which is why working how that works out is why we have these separate boxes, and we measure these not just with national data, but with local as well as national data, because the innovations have been in American cities 10 years plus before Ronald Reagan ran in 1980. I pointed out 6 years before that. Earlier than that, individual cities like Pete Flaherty, we have the case study of in Pittsburgh. The majority of U.S. cities, Democratic, were cutting back by 1974. 1978 was Prop 13. Taxpayers revolt referendum in California. In 1980, Ronald Reagan. But to say Ronald Reagan caused this stuff back there years before Reagan, no. Okay. Seen globally, Kentucky karaoke, we talked about Asia and the West compared. Just consider two intermediary propositions. First, the Tocqueville, and these are the core ideas of the book there. The Tocqueville proposal that citizen participation brings legitimacy and trust. And the second, the proposition of Balzac and Baudelaire, that the Bohemian fuels innovation. These two French-inspired theories failed when we first tested them in China, Korea, and Japan. And the 18 participants who were really part of our SCENES project, called the Kentucky Karaoke. We've been working with them for more than a decade, resulting in more subtle reformulation that integrates the arts into the global dynamics, entitled Kentucky Karaoke. And this decentralization and collegial engagement are essential for both theories of Tocquevillian participation and the Balzac Bohemian stuff. We have a more holistic theory by joining these contexts, where the rise of the arts is. Okay, so this is one example of an application. How? First, citizens are oriented toward arts and culture, as we've got evidence of. Like this is some of the most powerful. This is the World Values Survey, which is the biggest international continual survey of similar items over time. We've already talked about that. I'm just reminding you how it's the foundation of much of these other changes. First is citizens are oriented toward our arts and culture, showing a very significant growth. And then second, citizens have more impact on many political systems with the spread of new global organizations, like even in places with authoritarian political leaders, such as the Middle East, such as good chunks of Asia. You've had hospital or nurses or doctors who go and help people. Doctors Without Borders, the French organization. Doctors go all over Africa and other places, and they help people who are sick. All right, then the follow-up question is, why are these doctors here? And so the global linkages of those non-political, they're not explicitly political, but they do have political impacts to the degree that some countries have outlawed any foreign nonprofits from working in places. I think this was Tibet that may have done that. Yeah.
I believe both Russia and Hungary also passed such laws preventing nonprofits operating, both of which I think either this year or like the past.
Well, they still have, well, they have lots of domestic, but I talked a little bit about Russia and China and the transformation away from the earlier, older communists to the newer ones. But the international ones for sure. And so yes, Russia's a good place to look at the variations in these. But Russia has not outlawed all of these. That it's much more targeted. They've outlawed them. Okay. Like political systems, recent economies have been transformed by subject-specific niche markets. The iPhone generation label is a good example. Detailed studies by the French Minister of Culture document strong growth among young people in electronic cultural activities, even though other things are flat in France. Those we don't have in the survey of the world value system, but we do have. We got lots more rich detail on France because of the sources like this. The power of culture, and actually, that's it. We get several slides here that feature Paris, and we contrast and show how Paris is very different from Marseille. So we get different rules of the game in different places. The power of culture and soft power are recent additions to international relations, a theory that go beyond the traditional military and economic power concepts that people have used for decades. I mentioned cool Japan as well last time. The Chinese created a scenes on the last page, and then we'll check a bit. The Chinese created a Scenes Academy in June 2020, launched with 4 hours of presentations by over 350,000, viewed by 350,000 participants. And this continues with regular meetings and over 180 publications on scenes in China already. And I mentioned the scenes in the Red Star, 60 million viewers and adoption in the 5-year plan. The city of Chengdu is smaller than Beijing or Shanghai, but growing much faster, attracting more visitors and innovative jobs, building explicitly on scenes concepts in ways that we're working with. We have a 400-page draft book, working with people in the city of Chengdu, which is 4 times bigger than New York, London, and Paris. Scenes are still a new, open set of ideas, and I welcome discussion. Questions? Okay, so we'll continue online and we'll have maybe a little bit of you go. So sorry to lose you.
Dr. Clark, I apologize, but I also have a hard cutoff at 6 o'clock.
Okay, so we'll go to 6 o'clock. Any more slides there that link to any of this?
Yeah, your slides of Marseille, a few kind of looking over income, glamour, the overlap with income too.
Okay, maybe just slowly go through those, but we can respond to any good questions you want to raise.
One thing that I'm really interested in is I was talking to someone about this, but like it's so interesting to think about like the idea of scenes of kind of like building this aesthetic, building the kind of the aesthetic, this like lifestyle, this like presentation of like the life model that major focus. I'm curious to see how that like obviously we talk about like ball of blues in Chicago and force in Chicago, but I think it's interesting to think about that nationwide, especially in the United States, where there's so much political agitation against the idea of cities to begin with. Maybe I'm reading too much into like the historic anti-urbanist like kind of
Thomas Jefferson Armory.
But it's really interesting to think about kind of the contrast, like cities as a destination, these like very specific scenes of again, the life of it versus active agitation by certain figures, by certain groups in the media, certain groups in politics that are like, cities are evil, nothing good happens there, and kind of like almost painting an anti of any urban area as like that. I mean, that's not like a comment, a question so much, just that's something I'm curious to see how that like how that continues to play out in the United States.
For sure, and I mean, it's American, but it is not uniquely American. There are Marxist studies that have featured or tried to explain the rise of democracy, contrasting England historically with Russia and China. And the key variable making them different is the salience of the rural joined with the urban, which happened in England in ways that did not happen in France, did not happen in Germany, and especially not in China or Russia. So in that sense, the American stronger focus still on the rural alone as the good and the cities as the bad from the early 19th through the mid-19th century on up through Marlboro cigarettes, the cowboys, the good and the bad of the cowboy and the Hollywood film of the cowboy fighting against the outlaw, etc. This has become more complicated since 1968 with films like Bonnie and Clyde, where the outlaws robbing banks and the heroes can rob the banks with Bonnie and Clyde. That shows the transformation of parts of this aesthetic in ways that 68 was a challenge in that film. So simultaneously, we have the massive thing that demographers and urban economists and geographers talked about in the 50s and 60s was suburbanization. No longer, I mean, that is, no longer is it just urban rural people move to suburbs. That reversed in many respects in the 80s and 90s. So you have more people who may have gone there for the schools and for their children, but when their children go away to college, they then come and live in a downtown apartment. That was new in numbers. That became a national social transformation in ways. But the point is we have both. In that sense, we're like the English example of combining the urbane with the ruralia, and documenting that by neighborhood is something that the Chicago sociologist led by Peter Schills did nicely in the 1950s and 60s in ways that theoretically with Claude Fisher that continued on. Yeah, so we may be winding down with if we're winding down with your system. I'll stop, but I'll carry on if you're still.
I'm still set up, right? I'm gonna be set up for a few minutes.
Okay, good. I just can't quite tell.
No.
See the plugs.
Of course.
Okay, go ahead.
I have unrelated questions and comments, but first, I was passing through Bronzeville today on the way to, and I was taking the 47th line, 15 bus to the 47th Red Line station, and when we passed, we passed underneath the green. First, 51st night, we did King Drive. And I saw this thing called Boxville.
Stuff people what?
This thing called Boxville. I don't know
Boxville.
what you think about it. It's like some kind of business incubator done entirely out of like a bunch of shipping containers. It's almost like a little mini village right under the station.
Okay, I don't know about that one. I'll have to bike down there and check it out. But we had a presentation by a woman who really is who's using those boxes to do exactly this. And she's been consulting with the city, with the park district, and with little firms that are doing that because they're cheap and adaptable, and they're great ways to start a new little firm with minimal cost.
What's her name?
I can't tell you from the top of my head, but she teaches at the Art Institute and has her own. She was at a conference which talked just for an hour and we.
So cool.
I mean, it's happening around the world.
And again, I don't wanna like distract, there are people with actual questions.
There is a question actually. Sarah, who's watching through Zoom, wants to know, Dr. Clark, you would say the impact of the arts differs across regions around the world. For example, Sarah says that she would say that in some more conservative countries, the arts have less of an impact on policy. For liberal countries, the arts does have more of an effect on policies.
Yeah, and that is true, but one of my main points today is to say, don't use country data, get into smaller units, because that way you can see much more differentiations. If you use it like that, you end up income substitute, it's like population size. If you just look at big cities and small cities, population drives everything. But then you get the components of population size, like crime and so forth. And the impact of population more and smaller, if you identify the components, and those are the components that we want to really understand more, like how you use to build new jobs. So if you see an increase in jobs, how much is explained by using boxes, for instance? Or one example in Chicago, when Harold Washington was mayor, he wanted to let more poor, low-income folks, black and white, be able to have more homes, to be able to build homes more inexpensively, because it was so expensive because of the requirements for high-quality pipes and water and so forth, that he said, okay, look, we can have plastic pipes. Plastic, where they're much cheaper, they're riskier, they break, they leak, and so forth, but they're cheaper, and you can build more houses using them, et cetera. So that kind of thing lowered the cost, increased the production of, and it was a political decision to do that, and it had big impacts more in low-income areas, but it was not just income alone. It was a political decision countering the normal workings of the market. So I'll stop there, not to say that any of these are really are simply wrong, but I've used the examples of population size in nations to illustrate the general point of why we want to try to move beyond the big simple variables to the more subtle components, using case studies, and then when we can find it, the big data that I've cited. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you, folks. Good discussion, and we